In 1998, a retired couple with 43 years of marriage and a flawless sailing record vanished from the Pacific Ocean without sending a single distress signal. Their perfectly maintained yacht, their emergency equipment, their decades of maritime experience, all rendered meaningless in a single night somewhere off the California coast. But 4 months later, when a commercial shipper spotted something floating in the shipping lane 60 miles from shore, the discovery would shatter every assumption about what had happened to Harold and Margaret Whitmore, and reveal a truth so disturbing that it would redefine the very nature of their disappearance. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marina as Detective Sarah Chen stood at the edge of the dock, staring out at the endless expanse of water that had become both graveyard and crime scene. In her 15 years on the force, she had worked hundreds of cases: missing persons, domestic violence, armed robbery, even the occasional homicide that made headlines in their small coastal community. But this one would haunt her differently. This one would test everything she believed about justice, family, and the lengths people would go to protect their secrets. The call that had summoned her here came at 5:47 a.m., delivered in the clipped, professional tone that always preceded the kind of news that changed everything. Captain Morrison's voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much over too many years, but even his seasoned detachment couldn't entirely mask the underlying tension as he explained what the Pacific Endeavor had found floating in the Iat shipping lanes. Harold and Margaret Whitmore had lived the kind of retirement most people dream about, the kind that appears in glossy travel magazines and inspires envious conversations at cocktail parties. At 68 and 65 respectively, they had spent their golden years sailing the Pacific coast in their 30-foot sailboat, the Sea Dream, a vessel that Harold had researched for 2 years before purchasing and then spent another year customizing to their exact specifications. Harold, a former aerospace engineer whose career had been built on precision and attention to detail, had meticulously maintained every inch of their sailboat. He kept detailed logs of weather patterns, maintenance schedules, and navigation routes that read like technical manuals. His workshop in their garage contained backup parts for every system on the boat, organized with the same methodical care he had once applied to designing aircraft components. Margaret, a retired librarian with 37 years of service to the San Diego Public Library System, had approached their sailing adventures with the same systematic thoroughness she had once applied to cataloging rare manuscripts. She documented their travels in detailed journals, complete with hand-drawn maps, pressed flowers from coastal hikes, and photographs carefully arranged in albums that told the story of each voyage. Her dream was to eventually compile these records into a book about retirement sailing, a guide for other couples who might want to follow their example. Their daughter, Patricia, had spoken to them every Sunday without fail for 3 years, ever since they had embarked on their full-time sailing lifestyle. The calls came like clockwork, usually around 2 in the afternoon Pacific time, filled with stories of hidden coves where they had anchored overnight, friendly harbor masters who had recommended local restaurants, and the simple joy of watching dolphins race alongside their boat in the early morning light. These conversations had established a rhythm that Patricia had come to depend upon, a weekly connection that bridged the physical distance between her life as a marketing executive in Denver and her parents' nomadic existence on the water. Harold would always get on the line first, delivering a detailed weather report and explaining their planned route for the coming week with the precision of a flight plan. Margaret would then take over, sharing the human details, the people they had met, the books she was reading, the small daily observations that made their adventures feel real and immediate. When the first Sunday passed without a call, Patricia felt a flutter of concern that she tried to rationalize away. Her parents were experienced sailors who had weathered storms, equipment failures, and unexpected changes in weather patterns. Perhaps they were in a remote anchorage without cell service, or dealing with some minor mechanical issue that had delayed their schedule. She told herself that she was overreacting, that her parents' careful preparation and extensive experience would see them through whatever minor crisis had interrupted their routine. When the second Sunday came and went in silence, Patricia knew, with a certainty that comes from deep family bonds, that something was terribly wrong. She had tried calling their cell phone dozens of times, left voicemails that grew increasingly frantic, and even contacted the Coast Guard to inquire about any reported incidents involving sailboats. But the Pacific Ocean is vast and unforgiving, and even experienced sailors sometimes make fatal miscalculations or encounter circumstances beyond their control. The initial missing persons report painted a picture of an experienced sailing couple who had simply vanished somewhere between San Francisco and Los Angeles, a stretch of coastline that they had navigated successfully dozens of times over the past 3 years. Their last confirmed sighting was at a marina in Half Moon Bay, where the harbor master remembered Harold purchasing fuel and checking weather reports with his usual methodical attention to detail. They had mentioned heading south toward warmer waters and a small coastal town where Margaret had distant relatives they planned to visit. The marina's security cameras had captured footage of the Whitmores preparing the Sea Dream for departure, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had performed these routines hundreds of times. Harold could be seen checking lines and testing equipment, while Margaret stowed supplies and consulted her navigation charts. Their final appearance on camera showed them motoring out of the harbor just after dawn, Margaret waving to another sailing couple they had befriended during their 3-day stay. But the Pacific Ocean keeps its secrets well, and seasoned sailors sometimes make fatal miscalculations or encounter weather patterns that can overwhelm even the most carefully maintained vessels. The Coast Guard conducted extensive aerial searches covering thousands of square miles of ocean in expanding grid patterns that stretched from the California coast to the shipping lanes beyond the continental shelf. They issued maritime bulletins to commercial vessels, fishing boats, and other recreational sailors asking for any sightings of the Sea Dream or debris that might indicate its fate. Dozens of fellow sailors were interviewed, people who might have encountered the Whitmores during their final voyage or observed unusual weather patterns that could explain their disappearance. The sailing community, particularly those who lived aboard their boats full-time, rallied to support the search effort, sharing information through marine radio networks and online forums dedicated to coastal sailing. But each lead dissolved into the same frustrating dead end, the same conclusion that felt both logically sound and emotionally impossible to accept. Detective Chen had not been assigned to the case initially. Missing persons involving presumed boating accidents typically fell to the Coast Guard and specialized marine patrol units who had the expertise and equipment necessary to investigate maritime incidents. Local law enforcement usually became involved only when evidence suggested criminal activity or when bodies were recovered in circumstances that required forensic investigation. But when Captain Morrison called her into his office 4 months after the Whitmores' disappearance, the tone of his voice and the careful way he closed the door behind her made it clear that the case had taken a darker turn. The call had come in at dawn from the Pacific Endeavor, a commercial shipping vessel traveling northbound from Los Angeles to Seattle with a cargo of manufactured goods bound for export to Asia. Captain James Rodriguez had been making this route for 12 years, guiding massive container ships through shipping lanes that stretched like highways across the Pacific. He knew the difference between normal maritime debris, the detritus of ocean commerce that constantly floated in the shipping channels, and something more sinister. What his crew had spotted floating in the shipping lane, approximately 60 miles off the coast of Monterey, was clearly human remains, and the experienced captain's immediate radio call to the Coast Guard had set in motion a recovery operation that would transform a missing persons case into something far more disturbing. The recovery operation took 6 hours in choppy seas that made the dangerous work even more challenging and heartbreaking. The Coast Guard cutter Steadfast arrived on scene first, followed by Detective Chen and a forensic team from the county coroner's office who had been specially trained in maritime death investigations. The bodies, which had been floating for an unknown period of time, showed signs of prolonged exposure to salt water and marine life, but even the preliminary examination conducted on the Coast Guard vessel revealed details that immediately ruled out accidental drowning. Harold Whitmore's body showed signs of blunt force trauma to the skull, injuries that were inconsistent with typical sailing accidents or drowning scenarios. More disturbing still, both bodies were found tethered together, with rope, bound in a way that suggested deliberate action rather than any attempt at survival or accident prevention. Margaret's remains revealed similar traumatic injuries and evidence of a violent struggle that had clearly taken place before their entry into the water. Detective Chen stood in the sterile brightness of the county morgue 2 days later, as Dr. Amanda Foster, the chief medical examiner, explained her preliminary findings with a clinical precision that made horrific facts somehow bearable to hear. The positioning of the bodies, the nature of their injuries, the complete absence of their sailboat, and most significantly, the rope used to bind them together, all pointed to one inescapable conclusion that would reshape the entire investigation. Harold and Margaret Whitmore had not died in a sailing accident. They had not been overwhelmed by unexpected weather or suffered equipment failure that led to their vessel sinking beneath the Pacific swells. They had been murdered, killed by someone who had then disposed of their bodies in the ocean, while somehow making their sailboat disappear without a trace. The investigation that followed would consume Detective Chen's life for the next 8 months, transforming her understanding of the case from a tragic accident into a complex homicide that involved careful planning, intimate betrayal, and a level of premeditation that made the crime even more disturbing. She began by retracing the Whitmores' final weeks, interviewing everyone from marina staff to neighboring boat owners, building a detailed timeline of their activities and interactions in the days leading up to their disappearance. Patricia flew in from Denver to assist with the investigation, providing financial records, insurance documents, and boxes of her parents' personal correspondence that might reveal enemies, financial troubles, or other factors that could explain why someone would want them dead. What emerged from this painstaking review was a portrait of a couple who were not just financially comfortable, but wealthy in ways that few people knew and that they had deliberately kept private. Harold's engineering career had included several lucrative patents related to aerospace navigation systems, innovations that continued to generate royalty payments decades after their development. His careful investments over 4 decades, guided by the same methodical approach he applied to everything else in his life, had built a portfolio worth nearly $2 million. Margaret had inherited coastal property from her family, land, that had appreciated dramatically as California real estate values soared throughout the 1990s. Together, they owned assets that made them attractive targets for various forms of financial crime, though they lived modestly and rarely spoke about their wealth, even to close friends. Their sailboat, while well-maintained and equipped with quality systems, was not ostentatious by marina standards. Their lifestyle, while comfortable, did not advertise the substantial wealth that Patricia discovered as she worked through their financial records with Detective Chen. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source, a detail that initially seemed insignificant but would ultimately unravel the entire conspiracy. While reviewing harbor records from Half Moon Bay, Detective Chen noticed that another boat had departed the same day as the Whitmores, following the same general, heading toward the Southern California coast. The departure time, logged just 2 hours after the Sea Dream left the harbor, was close enough to suggest possible coordination or pursuit. The Midnight Runner, a sleek 40-foot motor yacht worth considerably more than the Whitmore's sailboat, was registered to Thomas Brennan, a name that appeared frequently in the couple's financial records as their investment advisor and personal friend. Brennan had managed a significant portion of the Whitmore's portfolio for 5 years, earning their trust through consistent returns and personal attention that went far beyond typical client relationships. He had visited them at marinas during their travels, joined them for dinners at waterfront restaurants, and even sailed with them on several short trips that had been documented in Margaret's journals with obvious fondness and appreciation. The entries describing these shared adventures painted Brennan as more than their financial advisor. He was someone they considered a friend, a younger man who shared their love of sailing and who had helped them navigate the complexities of managing their retirement wealth. But friendship had not prevented Thomas Brennan from systematically embezzling from their accounts over a period of 18 months. Using his access to their investment portfolio and their trusting nature regarding financial matters they did not fully understand, he had been siphoning funds through a complex series of fake transactions, inflated fees, and phantom investment. Opportunities that existed only on paper. The scheme was sophisticated, designed to be virtually undetectable to clients who trusted their advisor completely and who lacked the expertise to scrutinize complex financial statements. Over 18 months, Brennan had stolen nearly $400,000, and Detective Chen's investigation revealed that the elaborate fraud was beginning to unravel in ways that threatened to expose not only his theft from the Whitmores, but similar schemes involving other clients. Chen discovered that Brennan had been facing his own financial crisis that made the Whitmore's wealth not just attractive, but necessary for his survival. His investment firm was under investigation by federal regulators for irregularities that had been discovered during a routine audit. His personal debts, including gambling losses that had spiraled beyond his ability to pay, had reached the point where creditors were threatening legal action. Several other clients had begun asking uncomfortable questions about their account performance, questions that threatened to trigger a comprehensive review of his business practices. The Whitmores, with their trusting nature, limited understanding of complex financial instruments, and a tendency to ask general questions rather than demanding detailed explanations, had been the perfect victims for his desperate scheme. But Detective Chen's investigation revealed that Harold, with his engineer's methodical mind, had recently begun asking more specific questions about their investments, questions that suggested he was starting to understand that something was wrong. The evidence painted a chilling timeline of calculated murder that had been disguised as a maritime accident. Brennan had known the Whitmores' travel plans because they had discussed their sailing schedule during their last meeting, a dinner at a waterfront restaurant in San Francisco, where Margaret had excitedly described their planned route south and their intentions to visit her relatives. He had followed them from Half Moon Bay, likely making contact while they were anchored for the night in a secluded cove that would have provided the perfect location for what came next. Forensic analysis of rope samples found on Brennan's yacht during a search warrant execution matched the rope used to bind the Whitmores' bodies together. More damning still, luminol testing revealed traces of blood on the Midnight Runner's deck and cabin, evidence that had survived despite obvious attempts to clean and bleach the entire interior of the vessel. DNA analysis confirmed that the blood belonged to Harold Whitmore, placing him aboard Brennan's boat during what must have been the final hours of his life. The confrontation took place in the interview room of the Monterey County Sheriff's Department on a gray October morning that seemed to mirror the somber weight of the case that had consumed Detective Chen's life for 8 months. Brennan, accompanied by his attorney, maintained his innocence through 3 hours of methodical questioning, claiming to have no knowledge of the Whitmores' fate beyond their failure to return phone calls in recent months, He suggested that their deaths were the result of a tragic sailing accident, perhaps caused by unexpected weather or equipment failure that had overwhelmed even their considerable experience. When pressed about the evidence of violence, he proposed that they might have been victims of maritime piracy, a rare but not unknown crime in waters frequented by drug smugglers and other criminals who might target wealthy recreational sailors, but it was the revelation of the financial records that finally broke through Brennan's carefully maintained composure. When Detective Chen laid out the documentation showing the systematic theft from the Whitmores' accounts, when she explained in precise detail how the couple had trusted him completely while he methodically stole their life savings, something fundamental shifted in his demeanor. The polished confidence that had served him so well in his financial career crumbled, replaced by the hollow-eyed desperation of a man who had crossed a line from which there could be no return. The confession, when it finally came after another 2 hours of interrogation, was delivered in a monotone voice that seemed disconnected from the horror of what he was describing. Brennan admitted to following the Whitmores to their anchorage in a secluded cove south of Monterey, boarding their boat under the pretense of a friendly surprise visit, and confronting them about his growing fear that Harold's recent questions indicated that his embezzlement had been discovered. The conversation had escalated rapidly when Harold, with his engineer's methodical mind and natural skepticism about anything that seemed technically implausible, had started connecting the pieces of Brennan's financial manipulation. Margaret had attempted to calm the situation, suggesting that any misunderstandings could be resolved through careful review of their accounts, but her reasonable approach had only intensified Brennan's panic about exposure and prosecution. What followed was a struggle that ended with two people who had trusted him lying dead on the deck of their beloved sailboat. Brennan had weighted their bodies with anchor chain and thrown them overboard, then spent the rest of the night sailing the Sea Dream far out to sea, where he scuttled it, watching it disappear beneath the Pacific swells, along with what he believed was any evidence of what had transpired. He had returned to shore, believing that he had committed the perfect crime, that Harold and Margaret Whitmore would simply become another unsolved missing persons case in the vast Pacific Ocean. But the ocean had not kept his secret. The weights had come loose during the months the bodies spent underwater, allowing them to surface in the shipping lanes where commercial traffic would ensure their discovery. The truth had emerged through the methodical work of investigators who refused to accept that good people simply vanish without explanation, and who recognize that even the most carefully planned crimes leave traces that can be discovered through patient, thorough investigation. The trial that followed drew national attention, partly because of the brutal nature of the crime, but mostly because of the betrayal of trust that lay at its heart. Patricia Whitmore testified about her parents' excitement over their retirement adventures, their careful financial planning for their golden years, and their absolute belief that Thomas Brennan was helping them secure their future rather than systematically stealing from them. She spoke about Sunday phone calls that would never come again, about sailing journals that would never become the book her mother had dreamed of writing, and about the cruel irony that her parents had died not from the ocean they loved, but from the greed of someone they had trusted. Her testimony was delivered with a composure that impressed the jury, but Detective Chen could see the profound grief that lay beneath her controlled exterior. Brennan was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, in delivering the sentence, spoke about the special responsibility that comes with managing other people's life savings, the sacred trust between financial advisors and their clients, and the profound betrayal represented by turning that trust into an opportunity for murder. Detective Chen attended the sentencing, sitting in the back of the courtroom as justice was formally served. But she knew that the real resolution had come months earlier, in the quiet moments she had spent with Patricia, helping her understand what had happened to her parents and why. the case had been solved through evidence and investigation, but it had been given meaning through the process of ensuring that Harold and Margaret Whitmore were remembered not as victims, but as people who had lived full, rich lives and deserved far better than the violence that ended them. The Sea Dream was never recovered, lying somewhere on the ocean floor as an underwater grave marker for dreams cut short by greed and desperation. But the Whitmore's memory lived on in the scholarship fund that Patricia established in their names, supporting young people who shared their love of sailing and adventure. The fund's first recipients were announced on a Sunday afternoon in May, exactly the time when Harold and Margaret would have been making their weekly phone call home. In her final report on the case, Detective Chen wrote about the importance of listening to families who insist that their loved ones would never simply disappear, about the value of methodical investigation even when initial evidence suggests a tragic accident, and about the way that financial desperation can transform trusted advisors into predators. She wrote about the Pacific Ocean, which had seemed like an accomplice to murder, but had ultimately become the witness that brought a killer to justice. The case remained, with Chen long after the paperwork was filed and the evidence was stored away in the department's archives. It reminded her why she had become a detective in the first place, not just to solve crimes, but to ensure that victims were not forgotten, that their stories were told completely and truthfully. Harold and Margaret Whitmore had deserved their retirement dreams of sailing into sunsets and discovering hidden harbors along the California coast. Instead, they had encountered a killer who saw their trust as weakness and their wealth as an opportunity that justified murder. But in the end, the ocean that had claimed their lives had also delivered justice. Their story had been told, their killer had been caught and convicted, and their daughter had found a way to honor their memory that would outlast the pain of their loss. It was not the ending anyone would have chosen, but it was an ending that served truth and provided the closure that allows grief to transform into something more peaceful and enduring. The marina where Detective Chen had first contemplated the case remained unchanged, with boats coming and going on tides that cared nothing for human tragedy or justice. But for those who had worked to solve the mystery of Harold and Margaret Whitmore's disappearance, the sight of those waters would always carry the reminder that truth has a way of surfacing, even from the deepest places where people try to hide. Their secrets. The Pacific Ocean had kept the Whitmore's bodies for 4 months, but it had not kept their story from being told or their killer from facing justice.